Hi, my name is Andrew Young, and I will be presenting on the instability in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is located in the picture seen now as the red area to the right of Botswana, and is a well-known country for many reasons. I will be focusing on four of those major reasons in this video. The four reasons that I will be focusing on are crime, sickness like HIV/AIDS, political unrest and economic downfall, and lastly the effect that the 90-year-old Robert Mugabe has on Zimbabwe. I will first address the economic and political struggles that Zimbabwe endures. The 2014 Index of Economic Freedom states, quote, "Over the 20-year history of the index, Zimbabwe's economic freedom has deteriorated by 13 points, the fourth worst score drop. Significant declines in 7 of the 10 economic freedoms include 40-point drops in scores for property rights and investment freedom. Regulatory efficiency has greatly diminished, as indicated by considerable score declines in business freedom and labor freedom." End quote. As you can see from the image shown on the annual rate of inflation, years 2000 to 2002, there was not much inflation or deflation at all. You could almost say that the annual rate at that time was perfection. Although from years 2005 to 2007, Zimbabwe saw one of the worst tragedies in economic history. By the end of the year 2007, the percentage reached a thought to be impossible 7,634.8%. And now, following that image, I will present some of the history of Zimbabwe's economic stance leading up into recent years. In 1980, Zimbabwe was given independence from the United Kingdom, and the new democratic country had many characteristics that made the future of the country seem extremely profitable. Zimbabwe had a large and sophisticated economy, which was based upon tobacco and wheat sales, protection of private property rights, and freedom of press, along with many other civil liberties. However, due to the dictatorship by Robert Mugabe that resulted, the economy has completely plummeted, and has made Zimbabwe become one of the poorest countries in the world. The economic and political collapse of Zimbabwe is largely due to the corruption of the government. This corruption has come from or stemmed from Robert Mugabe. Mugabe was elected as the Prime Minister of Zimbabwe in 1980. At the end of the war in Zimbabwe in 1979, many Africans considered Mugabe to be a hero due to his position as a leader of a rebel group against the white minority rule. Mugabe has remained in power since 1980. In the 2013 election, the Zimbabwe Election Commission proclaimed Mugabe to be the victor of the election for Prime Minister. Many Zimbabweans were very unsure of the validity of Mugabe's re-election due to the amount of vote rigging and fraud that was being committed throughout the election process. David Coulthard states that the core problem in Zimbabwe is the corrupt political elite that has run the country for far too long. Mugabe and his supporters, determined to keep their power, consistently fail to take responsibility for the extreme poverty and horrible living conditions in Zimbabwe, such as the genocide that occurred in Matabeleland in the early 1980s. The meltdown of the Zimbabwean economy is best expressed by the statistics that have been recorded since 1980. The US dollar, which was previously weaker than the Zimbabwean dollar, is now equal to 10 million Zimbabwean dollars. This has resulted in a 150,000% increase in the inflation rate since 1980. Furthermore, Zimbabwe is currently experiencing an 80% unemployment rate. The life expectancy of men and women, which is one of the lowest in the entire world, has fallen from 57 years to 34 years for women and 54 years to 37 years for men. This extreme decrease in the life expectancy of men and women is highly attributed to the increase in HIV/AIDS, which will be discussed further along in my presentation in more depth. Zimbabwe, which started off in 1980 as an economically prosperous country that had a bright future ahead, has become one of the most poorest countries and most economically destitute countries in the world due to the extreme efforts of one man, Robert Mugabe, to retain his power at the expense of all of his people. Crime continues to be one of the larger results of the economic destitution of Zimbabweans. There are two main types of crime in Zimbabwe: street crime and home crime. Street crime is one of the largest threats for tourists to Zimbabwe because tourists are seen as wealthier than the average Zimbabwean, so therefore they have more goods that can be stolen. Home criminals are becoming increasingly more of an issue. Rather than breaking into a house when no one is home, criminals will now break into a house in broad daylight, when the residents are at home. Most criminals who break into homes during the daylight are not too violent. They bring weapons with them as a threat, but they usually tie residents up in their homes and then proceed to rob the house, leaving the residents physically unharmed yet often mentally harmed. The lack of efficiency in the Zimbabwean police makes it much more easier for criminals to be effective. It takes the police a long time to respond to reports of crime, so criminals don't have to worry about being caught because they can usually escape quickly with no problems with the police. The last factor that contributes to the instability in Zimbabwe is the presence of HIV/AIDS. Approximately 15% of the Zimbabwean population is living with HIV/AIDS. There have been many efforts made by non-governmental, religious, and academic organizations, also called NAC, centered on educating the public about HIV/AIDS. Through NAC efforts, the number of people living with HIV in Zimbabwe decreased by 50% during the years 2001 to 2011 time span. A significant amount of this decrease was due to people dying from HIV, but NIC has had a significant impact educating the public about the devastating effects of HIV and how to avoid the disease. And to end this presentation, here is a personal account of a family affected by Robert Mugabe and his corrupt dictatorship. One of my sister's sorority sisters at the University of Texas at Austin was born and raised in Zimbabwe. Her father was a very successful farmer and his wealth continued to grow in Zimbabwe. Over the time that his wealth grew, the government noticed his success and felt threatened by it. As a result, the family recognized that the government was going to come take their family, and if they did not cooperate, be killed. In response, the family fled from the dictatorship in Zimbabwe to Europe, and then soon after the United States of America. Clearly, by this first-hand experience, it is shown that ever since the initial election of Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe has seen some of the worst years of the nation's history. And now here's a video discussing more about the instability in Zimbabwe.
Welcome to the Cato Institute. My name is Marian Tupi. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity here at the Cato Institute. In 1980, Zimbabwe was poised to be a success story. The country had independent judiciary, it had a large and sophisticated economy, it had protection of private property rights, free press, and many other institutions and institutions that we now associate with high economic growth. Today, of course, Zimbabwe is a dictatorship in the midst of an economic meltdown. It has 150,000% inflation, 80% unemployment. Zimbabwean dollar, which used to be stronger than American dollar, now trades at $10 million Zimbabwean dollars to $1 US. The country is ravaged by AIDS, and concomitantly, it has one of the lowest life expectancies in the world. In expectations of this week's election in Zimbabwe, which will take place on March 20th.
Has a life expectancy of 34 years for women, 37 years for men. It's the lowest life expectancy in the region. 3,500 deaths per week occur in Zimbabwe. 3,500 deaths per week is the norm, is the average in the country. Now that is a combination of high HIV, but malnutrition as well. It's an enormous rate, and one that simply is not very well reported. 1/2 billion people have already died in Zimbabwe from what David describes as this decade of suffering that stems back to the political demise that they are in. When you go through David's paper, you have to take note and fall back on what he calls the core problem. The quote, the corrupt political elite that has run the country for too long.
hope you enjoyed this video from Andrew Young Productions, aka Stuart Little Productions. I hope you learned from this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.